Suddenly this week, it's become respectable to wonder if COVID-19 actually did originate in the virus lab in Wuhan, China. I guess that's good news for anybody who cares about the fair treatment of evidence. Unfortunately, also over the last few weeks, it seems to have become almost respectable in some circles to excuse raw antisemitism in the light of war conditions in Gaza. We're going to explore these issues and a number of others in today's episode of Independent Outlook. Welcome, everybody. I'm Graham Walker, coming to you from the Independent Institute. We are here in Oakland, California, across the bay from San Francisco. And we're delighted to bring you what I think is an independent perspective or outlook on the issues of the day. And of course, I'm joined for this conversation by my two very erudite colleagues. First of all, David Theroux. Welcome, David Theroux, president of the Independent Institute.
Thank you, Graham.
Great to have you with us. Also, Bill Evers, who is Dr. Williamson Evers. We call him Bill, who is the director of our Center on Educational Excellence. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you both, obviously. So today is a good day to talk about the issue of where the COVID-19 virus came from. It's an especially good day because of the fact that earlier today, President Biden made this big announcement. He reported to the country that he had gotten a report previously commissioned from his intelligence experts. And the report seemed inconclusive as to whether the virus originally emerged from human contact with an infected animal or from a laboratory accident, he said. And so he wanted, quote unquote, additional follow-up. He's now mandated a new study, supposed to be done in 90 days, because President Biden admits we do not believe there is sufficient information to assess one explanation to be more likely than the other explanation. Wow. Now, wasn't it just, am I right here, mistaken that just a few months ago, only right-wing crackpot wackos wearing tin hats who are QAnon followers were willing to consider the possibility, which would to ordinary people seem pretty likely, that when you've got a coronavirus lab in Wuhan and the coronavirus emerges from Wuhan, that it might well have been connected. Crazy crackpots said that, but now suddenly the President of the United States is entertaining that explanation. What's this mean?
Well, I think you're very colorful, but
I'm trying to be.
but some serious people also entertained this from early days.
Yes.
Certainly Senator Cotton entertained it. A number of the hosts on Fox News Channel entertained it. They didn't generally say, we know it happened this way, but they said
Right.
This deserves a lot of consideration. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence. Look where it broke out and look what's right next door. The bat caves are not next door, the lab is.
No, that's right.
And so the real thing that drove the president to make this announcement was the stories that there were two things. One was a leak of information that the State Department had gathered that 3 people had been hospitalized in Wuhan in November with coronavirus type symptoms. And second was that his administration had shut down the Trump administration, the Pompeo State Department's investigation into this, which was where the information about the 3 people had come from. And so having shut this down, he looked really bad now that the information has come out about specific people and how long ago it was. And so he's trying to scramble to catch up like a politician would do.
So just to be clear, it was embarrassing because there were 3 people from the lab who they were so sick with COVID-like symptoms, they had to be hospitalized. And this was at least a month before anybody thought there was anything going on with a new virus.
Right. This is November 2019.
Exactly.
The first case of COVID in China was in early December. And the sorry aspect of this Biden situation is that he totally backpedaled just 24 hours after CNN ran a story about the fact that he had secretly canceled this State Department study.
Right.
And so the Biden people are they're unscrupulous. They're totally politically motivated, and it's not based on the science. It's not even based on common sense.
It's based on reacting to CNN and the
Right,
Wall Street
exactly.
Journal.
But the bigger story about the skepticism and dismissal and people being called conspiracy nuts and so forth, totally reversed, starting with the expose in the magazine, The Bulletin and the Atomic Scientist by Nicholas Wade. It's a detailed study article.
And he's
basically
He's a former highly reputable science writer for the New York Times, many decades.
Right. So the difference was that the ideological credentials of people are far more important than science and honesty. And the idea of journalism being a field in which you're trying to get to the truth is trumped by politics. So Wade, to his great credit, and the Bulletin, to its great credit, ran this article, and that totally shocked the entire media. And so ever since then, we've seen it percolating through and backtracking. The Washington Post, for example, this one reporter, Kessler, attacked Senator
Kessler's
Cotton.
their fact-checking guy.
Right, their fact-checking guy attacked Kessler and Senator Cruz. Basically,
Or are they the ones who
belittling
give
them.
out those Pinocchio things?
Well, Cruz gave out
No, the Washington Post, Kessler does give out.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
he
right.
gives out Pinocchios, but now Cruz is imitating by giving
That's
out his
right.
own Pinocchios.
He gave out his own for Pinocchio in response. But now we've seen this reversal in the establishment. Of course, Trump's not in power now. Trump was talking about it was the Chinese virus at Wuhan.
Right.
And that alone, to a lot of people, meant it was not credible. Fauci dismissed it repeatedly. And he's essentially been cornered on this as well.
Yes, he has.
So
Aaron Blake in the New York Times wrote an article saying journalists, out of their hostility to Trump, were blind to the fact that this could have emerged from this lab in Wuhan. Now, we still aren't sure of this.
Yeah, we don't know. The question is it possible? Should it be investigated? And everyone was saying, no, it's not possible. Don't even investigate it.
There's zero evidence that it came from a wet market. There absolutely is no evidence whatsoever. There's no evidence of any animals that would be transition animals, none whatsoever. After 15 months of investigating, all the evidence, circumstantial, points to the lab.
Yeah.
And part of this also is the cover-up that Fauci and others, Francis Collins and others did, of denying that they were funding gain of function research and that the money went to the Wuhan Lab. So as Fauci's been cornered, he's had to admit step by step that he was lying.
The gain of function.
Gain of function just means the virus can do certain things as they find it. And if they tinker with it, it can do more things. So it's gaining functions.
Why would you want a virus to gain functions?
Well, if you're trying to counter that virus, you want to see what it can do and then counter that. Also, of course, if you're engaged in germ warfare, you might want to do it.
I was going to say, yeah.
Right. And the Wuhan Institute of Virology is known for being a place where bioweapon research is conducted. Right. And Fauci himself has even suggested things in this regard. And people who've been involved in the research also are known for being in favor of such things. So to the Obama administration's credit, they essentially banned providing gain of function funding of gain of function funding. This was in 2013, I think, 14.
But bureaucrats will have their way.
Right. So in 2017, they had a loophole added to it.
Right.
But the only way the loophole could be approved was by the person who's the head of the NIAID or NIH or both. So that comes back to Fauci and to Francis Collins, who've claimed at different times they were opposed to it, nothing ever happened, they knew nothing about it. So this whole thing also brings in another whole dimension, which is the view that some people have that the deep state had a deliberate campaign to take down Trump. And whether the COVID-19 pandemic was used or extended or lied about,
exploited at least,
exploited, fear-mongered, and so forth.
Well, I think people's political opponents will take any handle that they can get.
Right.
I think the key thing, by the way, is not so much that Fauci and Collins couldn't find this money, because in their vast budgets, which are a lot bigger than people realize, some of this may have just been too obscure. It's really the Chinese and their problems. I mean, the Chinese, after SARS, tried to have some kind of thing that would escape political shutdown of information. They tried to have doctors immediately putting into a central thing, but the local commissars in Wuhan blocked the doctors from reporting on this thing. I think Wade's conclusion to this article that he wrote in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists is so important that I want to just read a little bit, if that's okay.
I totally agree with you.
Okay.
You should read that bit.
Okay. If the case that COVID originated in a lab is so substantial, why isn't it more widely known? As may now be obvious, there are many people who have reason not to talk about it.
That's right.
The list is led, of course, by the Chinese authorities, but virologists in the United States and Europe have no great interest in igniting a public debate about the gain-of-function experiments that their community has been pursuing for years. Nor have other scientists stepped forward to raise the issue. Government research funds are distributed on the advice of committees of scientific experts drawn from universities. Anyone who rocks the boat by raising awkward political questions runs the risk that their grant will not be renewed, and their research career will be ended. Maybe good behavior is rewarded with many perks that slosh around the distribution system. And if you thought that certain people might be blotted their reputation for scientific objectivity after their partisan attacks on the lab escape scenario, look at the second and third names on the lists of recipients of the $82 million grant announced. Anyway, the point is, the scientific establishment procedures and the way money gets distributed in research grants all have incentives against properly pursuing safety and the public interest. This is not a good situation.
And the scientific enterprise is second to these other factors.
Political
in other words,
factors.
science is politicized.
And self-serving.
Right. Science
self-serving
is politicized.
in an ugly way, not
Right.
in a benign way.
We see this in many areas, including the climate issue. But I think that's been a rude awakening for a lot of people, including a lot of the mainstream media, to be confronted with this blaring scam that's been conducted. I mean, for example, in the campaign to discredit people raising the question of whether this should be looked into, did the virus escape from a lab, was Peter Daszak. So Peter Daszak put together a letter in the Lancet, which was signed by others, basically saying that there is no evidence for the lab's theory, hypothesis, and that people who raise it are just conspiracy mongers. No one in the media pointed out that Daszak was the conduit for the funding to the lab.
Right.
I mean, it's
at
so
least
shocking.
$600,000 worth.
No,
There's
we're
plenty
talking,
of people.
Oh, this is the $1.3 million.
There's plenty of people who
it's
look bad.
I think 6.7 million total.
Gracious.
Right, and but so the internal conflict of interest is so glaring that it's beyond shocking. So if we have an epidemic, which turns out was triggered by a lab funded by the U.S. government under essentially the blanket. In other words, not publicly known. Trump never knew about this. Who did, right? It had to be dug out persistently by the people who were being attacked by the establishment for even raising the question.
So I think bad as the United States is, and that's the United States government, I think we have to say something about how bad China is, because
right.
not only did they have this repression by the commissars and not letting them the doctors report what was going on, but because they have such a monolithic to somewhat totalitarian, certainly authoritarian system, they don't have alternative channels of information. So if you tried to put something out on the internet, that would get censored. If you tried to put something in your local newspaper about this, that would get censored. So in America, if you try to cover up something, it's pretty hard. People leak all over the place, and you can get published about it.
Thank goodness.
And I know this is, of course, a very good feature. And so, China decides, well, we don't want to look bad, or we don't want to look incompetent, and the local bureaucrats worry about, how they're going to survive politically. And so they clamp down on the truth. And as a result, millions of people die.
Yeah, power corrupts, and bureaucracy has a certain continuity wherever it's government bureaucracy has a certain continuity of how it functions, regardless of party, ideology, whatever. But I do think that who in America thought the CDC was complicit in facilitating a pandemic? I mean, who would have, and then covering up for it? Or that the National Institute of Health, which is supposed to be protecting people from these kinds of scourges, would be the funder of it. I mean, so I think that what we're seeing is the stripping away of a certain veil of ignorance, using a Rawlsian term, to see objectively what is at hand.
It's pretty troubling. And this idea that the government's science is going to be not unpolitical is rather exposed as a delusion.
Right. So this is really.
So this doesn't mean we're against science. We love science, all three
of
us.
What we're talking about is
we're
the
talking about
politicization.
incentives and politicalization, right?
Right. Exactly. And so I think that what we're seeing is a key element of the progressive narrative being questioned, essentially empirically, for being utterly false.
Scientific managers should tell us all what to do.
Right, exactly. And that these people are high priests.
And deceive and whatever.
Right. These are high priests of the culture that people, and they believe that when they say, well, look at the science. This is all based on the science. Well, when the person behind the curtain
we
is
want
exposed,
people to follow the science too, but we want it to be actual science.
Yeah.
That's right, exactly. So at the Independent Institute, we've had a number of articles in our quarterly journal, The Independent Review, about the problems of funding and the control of science by government institutions, and showing why science developed without that, and it needs to be strengthened by being depoliticized.
Liberate science from government.
Exactly. So I think that this is a huge shift, and it continues to percolate and resonate through the elite culture, and a lot of people who had their own skepticism about what was being told to them. I think, as you're saying, Graham, the average person would think, well, if this is the only place in China, one of the few places in the entire world that does this research, there are other places in the world that do research in pathologies and so forth and virology, but this one in particular had a specific expertise and concentration. I mean, the US government sent pathogens from around the world to this lab to be used. I mean, it's just amazing.
I also think the fact that the Biden people have now said they're going to do their own more thorough investigation shows that they're no longer upholding the World Health Organization as the be-all and end-all in this. And
having just sort of deferred to them last week.
That's
I
right.
know. It's, it's
right.
pretty
It's a stunning
another
turnaround.
obvious revealing political step on their part.
Right. I mean,
Right.
you know, I want to take a moment, if you let me, to come at some of these facts from a slightly different angle. It actually come to the same conclusion, but the different angle is this. If I can get this right in my own mind, while I would say that Dr. Fauci has been remarkably slippery over the past year or so, and has said a variety of things that makes me really wonder where he's coming from, I think that others may be examples of how even well-intentioned people who operate within this system of incentives and control can be kind of led in the wrong direction. For example, Francis Collins, there's a lot of reasons to have confidence in his good intentions and his expertise and so forth. But even he is part of a system where the incentives are such that, you know, he seemed not to realize, first of all, that money is fungible. You know, if you fund, you're not gaining gain of function research, he said at one point, but then it turns out, of course, you fund this money, then it frees up other money to do the gain of function research. Right. But then it turns out that actually they were undermining the Obama era prohibition on gain of function research, and he surely would have known about that. Even a good man, in other words, my point being, can find himself kind of caught up in the tangle of a system that operates with these incentives and these kind of controls.
I think it's worse than that, Graham, but I understand your point. But in Collins' case and Fauci's case, you really can't make that argument.
Especially in Fauci's case.
Right, and the reason is because and it's part of the public document from the Wuhan Lab by the head of the lab, the so-called Bat Lady, Batwoman, in
Dr.
which
Shi.
he thanks the NIH and NIAID and Dr. Fauci for providing the funding for the research, the gain of function research. So this was not something that was an accident.
Secret.
Or a secret. And I also would question the morality of people who believe that taxpayers should be forced to fund research to develop pathological, biological, dangerous entities in a country with an authoritarian state.
Exactly. Terrible, terrible judgment required for that.
And bad safety records.
And bad safety records. I
Now,
mean, the record, there are 4 levels apparently of safety in these labs worldwide. And the standard in the Wuhan lab was apparently no higher than what you find in a normal dentist's office.
Yeah. And,
So, I
and
mean,
it's not the right...
I think we are getting more and more depressed talking about this. We need to move to a new topic.
Well, hold on. There's a little more to say.
All right.
I mean, you know, David said a moment ago, not accidental. Well, I want to be really clear that people don't misunderstand that statement. I don't think you were saying that there was a deliberate intent to create COVID-19 and unleash it on the world on the part of American officials. I don't think that anyone's saying that.
No one's saying that, but I think that there was definitely complicity in developing the pathogen itself.
Yes, right.
And that's the whole point of gain of function.
Exactly.
And if you're picking a lab in the world that's known for, and this is not new, that was known for having not a high level of safety, why would you fund it with a dangerous pathogen like this?
Giving money to people
it's reckless,
you know.
and it's. I do think that, you know, the swamp has a factor. You know, power does corrupt, and I think that people of goodwill can be corrupted like people of ill will.
Right. And of course, as Bill pointed out, the Chinese government is actually the worst player in the story because they're the ones responsible for the relatively insecure and unsafe conditions in the lab. They're responsible for the bioweapon research going on there. They're responsible for
containing it at the beginning.
Concealing the information that could have spared millions of people their life. I mean, the U.S. government did not clamp down on the release of information from that lab. The Chinese government did.
Right. And to this day, the lab refuses to share the documents.
Right.
That's why we're not sure what happened.
That's right. That's
okay,
exactly
so you pointed out to us earlier this remarkable piece in the May 5th issue of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. Here's the very last piece. I want to read it just a little more because I think it's so striking. The author, Nicholas Wade, who is no right-winger, but in fact perhaps the opposite from a political point of view, he says, the more months pass without the natural emergence theory gaining a shred of supporting evidence, the less plausible it may seem.
Yep, that's right.
The common sense perception that a pandemic breaking out in Wuhan might have something to do with a Wuhan Lab cooking up novel viruses of maximal danger in unsafe conditions could eventually displace the ideological insistence that whatever Trump said can't be true.
That's right.
And then he concludes, let the reckoning begin.
Right, and the reckoning has begun.
It's remarkable. It really is. So changing the subject, but not entirely, I still want to talk a little bit about the virus. I found also remarkable that the New York Times over the past 2 weeks has been blowing the cover of the CDC on issues of perhaps less dramatic magnitude than we've just been talking about, but on the issue of masking and rules and so forth. The New York Times now has become a CDC skeptic.
Yes.
There's some remarkable reporting by their lead reporter on the subject, David Leonhardt, which is worth seeing. Where he
no conservative
in any way at all. But it turns out that the New York Times, through this gentleman's work, is now casting extreme doubt and skepticism on the claims by the CDC about the importance of masking. In particular, most recent issued guidelines urging people to wear masks even outdoors, especially if you're going to summer camp and you're a child, wear a mask all the time, they said, during this upcoming summer season. And because Rochelle Walensky, the head of the CDC, said that studies show that less than 10% of COVID transmission occurred outside. That was what her statement was. Okay, so less than 10%.
That's right. They dug into that.
Yeah, so they dug in. Less than 10%. Turns out that it's way less than 10%. In fact, it may be less than 1%. In fact,
because less than 10% sounds like 9%.
It sounds like 9%, exactly.
That's right.
Exactly. It turns out that it's actually 0.1% according to the best virologist that they spoke to for outside
This is nonsense that 9-year-olds, 8-year-olds, 7-year-olds going to summer camp should be going around in masks outside. That's ridiculous.
Right.
Right.
So what do masks do? They protect against, and of course it depends on how fine screened the mask is, but they essentially protect other people from you if you're infected and you're spitting out big droplets.
Mm-hmm.
They don't, unless they're very fine and very perfectly fitted, the little tiny droplets that are going to escape anyway.
Especially outdoors. I mean, this was
but
the
outdoors,
reason.
it doesn't matter. Nothing's going to happen outdoors.
They're also now pointing out that masks are pointless indoors. And
I don't think we're going to get into the exact.
Anyway, I think the main lesson here is that when Wade's piece came out, and that just was a shock, that a lot of these journalists are saying, well, I better distance myself from all the
social distance.
What other claims are not can be substantiated?
Right.
And so the masks are part of it. I think the next that's going to be increasingly questioned is the vaccines is going to be questioned, especially for children. For children, right? And I think, and there's more and more information coming out about serious problems from the vaccines. I mean, you have to remember that none of the vaccine companies have any liability. They are limited.
They've been granted exemptions.
Zero liability. The government agencies have no liability. So if it's safe, why? It's because they don't want to risk that, and they want their insurance rates to be.
It was a subsidy to speed things up.
Yeah,
I think to speed things. But
I think the most interesting thing is there was a great article in the Financial Times on who's our model nation, who did it perfectly, and so at one point they were saying, oh, Germany is doing it perfectly, and at another point, France is doing it well.
I thought it was
Japan
Florida.
Is doing it well,
I thought it was Florida.
Or South Korea is doing it well.
He's talking about before that.
I know.
So all these different countries and people would say, oh, such and such has cooperative spirit or deference to authority, and that's why the Germans are very well organized and buy their platform tickets to get on when they come into the train station. So it turns out that the disease doesn't pay any attention to this stuff. Every different in all the different countries of the world, they've tried all different policies. Basically, the disease is able to get around most of them. And the thing that is knocking the disease down is the prevalence of the vaccine and the increasing number of people who've survived the infection or gotten mild versions.
Right.
So that is what is bringing these numbers down. So now very few people are dying, very few people are getting serious cases.
What really troubles me, though, is when our academic or hyper-educated experts, whose expertise should command respect, when they overreach, the effect it has is that it calls into question the legitimacy or credibility of everything that managerial experts say. And that's really really regrettable. There are times when experts have expert knowledge, it's worth listening to them. But when so often under these ideological conditions, they overreach on the denying.
It's also self-interestedness. Look at the teachers union and how they have gamed this. They essentially went on a strike using health claims and extorted hundreds of millions, billions of dollars from different levels of government that they otherwise would not have gotten. And they did not have to work in person. I'm not saying it was easy to do remote learning, but it wasn't also very effective, except for some percent, 5 to 10% of the kids did fine and would like to continue. Of course, the unions are preventing them from continuing. New Jersey, New York, these states have said, oh, no, we're not going to allow remote learning anymore for the people who want it. I mean, who's the customer here? Is it just the head of the teachers unions, or is it parents and children?
Bill, what I'm also saying is that the attack on therapeutics like hydroxychloroquine and zinc, the push to have complete lockdowns and so on and so forth, all based allegedly on the science.
Right.
And either there was no science or people didn't know. Now we know that the therapeutics are extremely effective. They cost
certainly got much better at handling people.
Tiny cost.
Doctor care now.
So big pharma was not going to cash in. In India, as they increased the vaccines, the Indian rate of infections and deaths spiked. They ran out of vaccines relatively, and they shifted to the therapeutics, and the incidents have been dropping. So my point
I wouldn't want to be in India right now, truly.
No, absolutely not. But my point, again, is that I think Nicholas Wade should get a Pulitzer Prize for this.
Oh, I do too. Absolutely.
And I think
we'll see if that happens.
That's right. But I think that we should
some
we should
prizes
all be
should be taken
in his
away
debt,
from the New York Times.
Right, for doing this and courageously, and the Bulletin for being courageous to take the lead. But as I said, it's opening up other questions that people have had, including what you're talking about. Why are the teachers' unions being allowed to get away with this? What about the lockdowns? What about the view of masking people? I mean, one of the most recent things, of course, in the spirit of Gavin Newsom, was that Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, was caught after her edicts with a group of about 12 or 15 colleagues in a restaurant, unmasked, without 6-foot distancing. And so the elite is essentially admitting, and people are seeing, that the elite is admitting that these measures do not work. They're not important. They were used for other purposes. They're used for fear. They're used for keeping people in line and to push a progressive agenda.
Yeah.
And so as a result, I mean, again,
Whitmer and her friends were vaccinated. So in a sense, they were just prematurely living up to the
CDC's
but
that wasn't the
That
rules.
wasn't the claim.
Of course,
the claim was
of
Bill.
course,
The claim
of
was
course.
that if you're vaccinated, you still
Right,
could
that was
not
what
go to
she
a
said.
restaurant.
Was
Mhm.
You
obviously
still had to
wrong.
be 6 foot
It
distance.
was obviously wrong, and
Exactly.
but they were still not telling us that. They were behaving as if they knew the truth.
Okay, and here in
Anyway.
California, of course, things are changing because, I'm grateful for the fact that the statistics are showing improved conditions of public health. At the same time, it is pretty interesting that Governor Newsom, who is facing a recall largely because of his handling of the crisis, is now announcing complete cessation of all limitations as of June 15th. And with all these experts and leaders apparently misusing their position and overreaching, it's hard not to be skeptical about the motivations behind the so-called opening of California.
He wants to stave off the recall.
He wants to stay in office, yeah. And so, maybe sometimes bad incentives can produce good results. But it just seems to me a darn shame that people who should know better really would overreach, from their position of authority. We use the word science as a totem, to block any kind of discussion. That's really regrettable. And maybe we can all learn something from this era of overreach and not let people overreach.
Accountability is, personal responsibility.
Yeah, that's right.
Is inseparable to liberty. And to
another good
society.
thing in the sense of this sort of thing is that the Pennsylvania, the state legislature decided that the governor had taken too many steps that he had used emergency powers, he had used lockdowns, he had used closed businesses and restaurants and gyms and all this sort of stuff without really consulting the legislature, without getting additional powers or temporary things. And so they've said, no, if you're gonna have an emergency power, it expires. You're gonna they have checks and balances that they restored, and I think that's a very, very valuable thing. And I hope some of the other states where the government, including California, where the governors just kind of seized total state power, so to speak, push back on this.
I think in all those cases, the governors believed that they were exercising emergency powers previously granted. It just turns out that the grant of power had been far too broad and discretionary. Time to pull it back.
It's also not supposed to be forever. It's supposed to be like a one-day riot or something like that, and not a year.
And this goes back to Whitmer's use of emergency powers in Michigan.
Truly
as well.
Egregious. Yes.
In Pennsylvania, I think the vote was something like, was it 55 to 60% in favor of eliminating the emergency power for the governor. And I think part of it also relates to the fact that a lot of people remain unsettled about the November 3rd election. And there were legitimate questions about whether governors and others could change state election laws where the Constitution says that only legislatures can. And so here you have these governors with emergency...
That problem in Pennsylvania.
Right,
among other
exactly,
places.
yeah.
I would like to turn our gaze from the U.S. for a short spell here, at least for part of our remaining program hour here, to the Middle East, but also to the ramifications of the Middle Eastern conflict in Gaza and Israel back in North America and in Western Europe as well. As I said at the top of the program, I find it remarkably disturbing that there's this upsurge in attacks and critiques and both verbal and physical abuse against Jewish citizens, both in the U.S. and elsewhere. And the justification for all this seems to be that somehow Jews in Western Europe and North America are somehow taken to be representative of the Jewish state that is protecting itself against rocket attacks from Gaza. How can anti-Semitism be rearing its head without as much elite opposition as there should be?
Elites have already bought into critical race theory, and this is sort of a version of that, an older version.
That's right. Everything's binary, so we're going to put the Jews as the oppressor, and the Palestinian Arabs and anybody that's their cousin in as the victims.
And so it's not based on individual accountability, it's group identity.
Right.
And this is a very sad...
The only way, supposedly, you can see things. And here we
And
have.
so this critical, it's another dimension of why critical race theory and that kind of sort of collectivist thinking is not just wrong-handed, it's really evil. And
Right.
how many people are going to suffer from it? And you could, it's reversed too. If you attack a Palestinian because it's a Palestinian, that is equally wrong. But in this case, the incidence is overwhelmingly anti-Semitism. And
Clearly, yeah.
It's just remarkably disgraceful.
And if you look at the situation,
We want to have individual responsibility, and if there are land disputes in Jerusalem, they should be carefully and rigorously adjudicated. And it shouldn't be your group identity that decides whether you have a valid title or not.
Exactly
And sometimes possibly the Israeli authorities go into the Temple Mount and unplug the microphones of the Muslim officials in order to aid the president of Israel in giving a nearby talk, which they put at the wrong time of day because it was going to conflict with the call to prayer. And the Muslims can take that badly, but
yeah, I
it doesn't.
understand that.
It's not deserving of rocket fire falling on innocent people. It's not deserving of mobs in these mixed cities. And of course, many of them are Arab mobs attacking Jews, but there are Jewish mobs attacking Arabs. There's plenty of non-individual accountability going on in these situations. And to have this leap from there to Europe, and now have European mob style attacks coming in the United States, is very ugly and very counter to American culture, as we would certainly like it to be.
And it boils down to, again, the significance of the idea of the rule of law, that people should be free to make their own choices, but they're accountable for their choices. And this is a universal rule, and it should apply everywhere. And the reason why mobs come into existence is because they see what they consider an injustice. It may be an injustice, it may not be an injustice, but if they embrace the same mode of operandi, they're at least as culpable, if not more culpable. And I think that's what we're seeing. We're seeing this, again, this collectivist group identity politics exploding, and many innocent people being harmed.
The weird thing about it, and this is the eerie parallel that you mentioned a few moments ago, David, is that underlying the entire conflict in the Holy Land is the belief on the one side that the Jews, and the Jews alone of all people, are not entitled to have a state of their own, and that state is illegitimate, and should be, that the Jewish people should be driven into the sea, is still the official position of Hamas and PLO and many of the others in that area, because somehow the Jews are defined as being, by virtue of their Jewishness, somehow the oppressor, the evil, the wrong, never to be escaped from. Notwithstanding the fact that in Israel welcomes and treats its Muslim and Arab citizens, grants them citizenship rights and so forth, things that are not granted to Jews in adjoining Arab or Muslim countries. The Jewish state is a remarkable beacon of comparative respect for law and individual liberty in the Middle East. I say comparative because all judgments have to be comparative in these matters.
They do, and there's always room for improvement in every country.
Right. And the reason why we might be critical of takings, as in the Constitution, of people having their property taken in the United States, is the same issue in France or England or Israel or Egypt or any place. South Africa, you name it.
Includes Jews driven out in 1948 from Iraq or Morocco or something like that.
That's right, exactly.
So there's plenty of historical injustice, and it'd be good to rectify what you can.
But the question is, what is the basis for rectifying? And again, these ideas, these principles are the go-to. in every case.
Yeah, which is, as you say, a mirroring of this critical race theory, that somehow you define oppressor and oppressed, and these people are in identity groups. You bear a guilt by virtue of your birth, and you can never expunge it. You have to be forever in a posture of abject apology for who you are. And that's just so contrary to the natural law. It's contrary to the good of human nature, and it leads to these kind of conflicts. Makes me
Another
wonder,
little point about this is that when you overrule this idea of the rule of law and accountability and so forth, it then opens up a sort of Pandora's box of bad actors who take advantage of it. And in Hamas's case, they're basically doing the bidding of Iran. And it's this complexity. And I think, to the previous administration's credit, they were working out in a diplomatic way ways to reduce the conflict.
Using commerce and using
Exactly,
Yes.
right.
using mutually beneficial commerce
Exactly.
as a
And
way
so-
to calm and regularize things. Another thing is that this poisons, David's talking about how this is poisoning things. It poisons the political cultures in these countries.
yes,
You look in these neighboring Arab countries and you look, well, do you have a classical liberal party such as is found in pretty much every European country? No.
no.
I mean, maybe one existed in Egypt until the 1950s. Actually, the party still exists. It gave up its classical liberal pretensions. If you look in Israel, there was a liberal party that got folded into what's now Likud. But so classical liberal roots, people who were top economists in the early days of Israel and so forth. And there's still some small parties that adhere to this, but really the military situation that Israel is in has made national defense, national security, the defining feature, the spectrum on which all Israeli politics rotates. And, domestic policy, fortunately, they've gotten rid of a certain amount of the extreme socialism that the early country had. But there's still plenty that could be reformed and improved there. But they don't have time to do that because they're so busy in the international conflict and some internal conflict that's on a more tribalistic basis.
Particularly in the United States, we see elements of that as well.
Exactly.
So you have critical race theory, and then you have, in the name of protecting innocent black lives, a Marxist group in that name essentially attacking, burning buildings, killing people, and then progressive elites apologizing for it.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a universal thing, a universal issue,
Yeah.
which we should be very mindful of.
And the antidote to all of this is
Individual rights is
right.
the rule of law.
and the rule of law.
That's
Mhm.
right.
and spreading of commerce. And
Person is the idea
as a
human,
valuable person and
has
who should
human
be
worth and
respected.
dignity,
Exactly.
human worth and dignity, regardless of skin color or
Right.
ethnicity or
Religion,
whatever.
all of that.
Right.
History.
Yep.
We all operate really.
Some of their history, if they're a felonious convict, I'm not going to give them all the regard they might want.
They still have human worth and
Still have
dignity.
human rights. They
Right.
do. That's
and
right.
the, and
they
the
have
criteria
potential.
of their
That's right.
status is based on accountability.
I agree. I was just partly trying to be humorous there, but
So
we agree.
in Texas, there's this legislation underway in the state legislature in Austin, which, if passed by both houses and signed by the governor, would prevent the teaching of critical race theory in the public schools in Texas. And Bill, you were describing to me a little bit about what this proposed law would prohibit. Can you explain that again to everybody?
Thing is, you're not going to, fortunately, you're not going to say, I forbid critical race theory, because, then you've got a amorphous term there.
Yeah, that doesn't
But
wouldn't be right.
But what they're saying is, on the taxpayer's dime, public school teachers shall not be teaching that because of the color of your skin, because of your ethnicity, you're an oppressor. Or because of the color of your skin, you're a victim. And because of the color of your skin, this group, their skin, this group are all oppressors. Or because of the color of their skin or ethnicity or language, all of this group are victims.
And this requires new legislation? Don't we believe that already?
Well, this curriculum that's floating around in many areas, and of course we just had an instance of this in California in the math curriculum, tries to insinuate this binary, everything is seen through the lens of race, and everything is how math oppresses people, how math doesn't. How, math is math. Real math should be taught, not political propaganda.
Does anyone disagree with that, Bill? Apparently they do.
Yes, definitely.
Yes, they definitely do, because this curriculum is proceeding. They knocked out one egregious part, at least temporarily, but in the last few days, but it's proceeding, and it's going to be voted on by the State Board of Education in California in November, and has some procedural hoops to go through before then, and some time for public input. But it's marching along, and there are people in academia and some teachers that favor this, and they're going to impose it on everybody else, and of course on the taxpayers and the parents and the children.
Yeah,
these children are not only beaten down by not having regular face-to-face classrooms, the ones that need it, which is most, but now that they're having this politicized math. And some people in other countries must be laughing their heads off because, they're teaching math in that country.
So I would invite people to take a look at the article that my colleague here, Bill Evers, published in the Wall Street Journal, I guess it was last week now, if I'm not mistaken, about California's proposed math curricular standards, which really gives you a remarkable insight on how far we've come and how necessary it is to just hold on to ordinary common sense things like ordinary arithmetic, because it really is essential for our progress as a country to be able to be strong in math and all the things that clear mathematical understanding supports in science and technology and so much else. If we go down the route prescribed by the race divisive theory, we will lose our acuity in mathematics among our school children. Instead, they'll be indoctrinated in all these ideologies, which will do them no good.
The ironies, of course, is the people who are proponents of this claim there is no objective truth, there's no objectivity in how to solve a mathematical problem or other concepts. But they insist that their view is objectively true. And by
Right.
God, they're going to force it down your throat.
I'm going to say some of them believe there's no truth, but the other people say, no, there is truth. It's our dogmatic truth. So in China in the late 1960s, early 1970s, they had a thing instigated by Mao Zedong, who was the head of the Communist Party and ruler there, the dictator there, but he was losing his grip to some extent. So he got a kind of a civil war existing that he, from the top of the country,
He created a civil war, that's right.
Well,
Yeah.
he did. And so one of the main features of it, a lot of it took place in the educational system of the country. And one of the main features was red versus expert. And so he advanced the idea that, of course, he wanted both, but he advanced the idea that red was
we have
more,
to clarify, red meant communist.
Red meant communist.
Not
red,
the way we use it in America now.
It's just like the flag of communist China today and the old flag of the Soviet Union, strong red. So that, and so, people who were qualified teachers who knew the subject matter, say in math, would be driven out as, bourgeois opportunists or class enemies or representatives of the four olds or whatever reason, and they were sometimes beaten up by their students. And people were made teachers who weren't qualified, who hadn't really even gone necessarily very far in school. And not only that, but they grading fell, nobody failed academically, and grades were based on your political,
Right.
your political.
Sounds kind of familiar.
I think you can see how these things happen. And obviously, the United States is not China. I'm not comparing these people to, if I could do this on the French Revolution, I could do this on lots of different things, but it's how the dynamic of this sort of thing works, not equating the individuals involved to the Chinese of that day. But if you make something like science or math political, you will have terrible mistakes in the discipline, and you will retard the discipline, and you will lead to backwardness in your society. And the Russians under communism had Lysenkoism in genetics, and it was false and wrong.
It retarded their scientific progress.
And it meant that good scientists got purged and were not able to do their work and so forth. So
India had a similar practice too.
Right. So in a sense, it's important to have pluralism. It's important to have a lot of different institutions, a lot of different channels for achievement, a lot of private property which you can engage in enterprise that's protected from state action and state control.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't have this, the United States or Britain or whatever can have the same problem that these more politicized countries had. And, we know, as we're talking about science here and the coronavirus, that politics can affect things here. But unlike China, where it was very hard for the truth to come out and still hasn't, the Chinese are still blaming American fast food for coronavirus. No, I'm not kidding. I mean, it's crazy. Mm-hmm. Okay. But we have channels, and even though the government tries to tell us what to think, people resist, and they publish it and get it out in other ways. So we should be fighting to keep those institutions and that mentality of independence and freedom.
One sort of step further, let's assume that California does adopt these math standards and similar standards in other fields. Bill Barr recently gave a talk in which he was referring to critical race theory as not just unacceptable, but unconstitutional.
He did.
His conclusion was that any schools that teach it
imposed religion. It was like an imposed
religion, but it's unconstitutional,
right? And
they should receive no public funds.
Mm-hmm.
Or another way to look at it is he's suggesting that we might need, if this ideology prevails with this kind of religion type enthusiasm for it and doctrinaire imposition, the public should withdraw its support from public schools as institutions. They're no longer kind of Tocquevillian local institutions that are close to the people. They have become dominant. Elites have taken them over and imposing things on the people. And
if you add this to the shutdowns and the anxiety that many parents, especially mothers, have about the plight of their child, who is not just not learning, but is not interacting with other children, and has all sorts of psychological problems that are being recorded now. There is definitely a growing movement against the public schools, partly because parents are looking for practical solutions. They have to do something. But now if the schools are teaching, and it's not just critical race theories, other things too. They're basically teaching
it's extreme environmentalism too.
Environmentalism, it's all sorts of bizarre psychosexual things, and so on and so forth. So there is definitely an increasing movement to create alternatives to the public school system. And the aura that teachers' unions, getting back to what Bill was saying, is largely shattered now in many of these states. And so if I can make a shameless plug for this book,
good book.
Really Good Schools, is about the existence of low-cost private schools for the poor in the developing world worldwide, which are a fraction of the cost, far higher quality than the public schools, and there are lessons that Americans can learn from this that are very practical and meaningful. So I think that the COVID nightmare that people have been going through is going to produce some very interesting changes, and hopefully some of them positive.
Well, there's some big changes potentially on the horizon as people try and digest what happened to us as a country during this past year. A lot of mistakes were made. There's a lot of rethinking, and it could be a very fruitful period ahead. We're going to bring this to a close in a moment, but maybe an opportunity for either of you, first with Bill, any final parting shots to our friends from you, Bill?
It's great that the country is opening up again, and I think we should be optimistic, and the resilience of the public is going to give our society a boost, and it will restore things. But at the same time, things that were done that were wrong, and it's not a mistake to have indignation about this.
That's
and
right.
To try to fix it and try to rectify things and try to hold people accountable. And the governing class, the governing groups are going to try and evade this responsibility, but we, the public, should keep after them.
Any final thoughts from you, David?
Well, it's also in the push to try to have unlimited federal spending, essentially, is what it comes down to. Is it $2 trillion? Is it $6 trillion? Is it $100 trillion? I think, just as an aside, modern monetary theory, if it's not in the trash now, it will be soon, as inflation rears its ugly head.
Right.
But the spending, the debt, the interest group politics, the deceptions, the incompetence, I think all of that is providing lessons for people to learn and appreciate about America's heritage of liberty and the lessons that should be applied today, and will essentially strengthen the backbone of members of Congress and on the state level and local levels to stop and oppose these kinds of crazy directions and enable people to have opportunity and to flourish in the future. I see no reason why that can't be done.
Absolutely, yes. And I think probably in some future episodes of our Independent Outlook conversations, we might take up some of those fiscal issues in a little more depth than we have been able to do recently. Also, let me just invite our friends far and near. You can always go to our website, independent.org, for resources on all these topics and more. We have quite a remarkable array of books. We publish our quarterly Journal of Political Economy, the Independent Review, and we've always got fresh pieces on current issues of the day on our Beacon and Catalyst websites. So we invite you there.
Last plug, in the current issue of the Independent Review, there's a symposium called Virus and Leviathan, which addresses,
and here it is,
many of the issues that we've touched on today, and I hope people will get a copy and benefit from it, share it with others.
Absolutely. And we're so grateful for our friends at ThinkSpot who helped make this possible, get it out to our friends through that wonderful platform. And all of those who have joined us today, thank you so much, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye from the Independent Institute. Bye-bye.